Welcome to the Football Film Room Show. I'm Nick Kehoe. We've got some great stuff for you today. We're going to talk Bryce Young's 2024 bounce-back season and how getting benched probably saved his career with the Panthers. We'll dive into the Browns' quarterback situation and break down how Shedeur Sanders and Dillon Gabriel played this preseason. But before we do any of that, I want to go back in time. I want to go back to 1986, the New York Giants, and Phil Simms. Now stay with me. I'm going somewhere with this. This is related to Bryce Young. But that season, about 10 games in, the Giants were 8-2, and they appeared to be in control of the NFC East. They were definitely contenders in the NFC. They had a scary defense with guys like Lawrence Taylor, Harry Carson, you know all the names. Bill Belichick was a defensive coordinator. Bill Parcells was the head coach. They could run the ball. That's how they sustained their offense. The problem was they just couldn't throw it. Phil Simms was not having a good season. He had thrown 12 touchdowns and 14 interceptions to that point. He had one game where he threw 4 picks and basically cost the Giants the game. And everything kind of came to a boiling point in weeks 9 and 10 of the season. Across those 2 games, Simms completed less than 40% of his passes for 197 yards total, no touchdowns, 3 interceptions. It was ugly. He was getting booed. The media was tearing him apart. He was going to be the reason the Giants were not going to be able to reach the Super Bowl. And Simms knew how bad he was playing. In his own words, which you can hear him talk about in the NFL Films 1986 America's Game documentary, we got to a point where we were awful. We couldn't complete passes. We couldn't get it down the field at all. Now, this was Simms' 8th year in the NFL. He had battled through adversity, come back from injuries and benchings to really salvage his career. He'd won 2 playoff games. He was solidified as the Giants starter, no doubt about it. But for whatever reason, he just wasn't doing the things he needed to do to be an effective quarterback. He was playing tight, probably overthinking, afraid of making a mistake. And ironically, when you play the quarterback position that way, you end up making more mistakes because you hesitate. And Parcells sensed this. So before their Week 11 game against the Vikings, he went up to Simms and he said to him, "Don't pay any attention to what they're saying. Just go out there and play, and don't let the media affect you as far as trying to be a daring quarterback. You just go out there and let it go, and I will support you 100% no matter what." And according to Simms, that's all he needed to hear. Just his head coach telling him, "Don't be afraid to make a mistake, cut it loose," that unlocked him, and that was the end of the Giants' passing game struggles. Because in that very next game, he threw for 300 yards, led the Giants on a last-minute drive to win the game, converted a 4th and 17 to Bobby Johnson that lives on in Giants lore. And the Giants didn't look back. They won the rest of their regular season games. Phil Simms played much better throughout the regular season. And then when they got to the playoffs, they just ran over teams. They beat the 49ers and Redskins by a combined 66-3. Simms threw 5 touchdowns and no interceptions in those games. And then when they got to the Super Bowl, Simms was out of his mind. 22 of 25, 288 yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks. Had as many touchdown passes as incompletions. Won the Super Bowl MVP. Did the whole Disneyland thing. Came through on the biggest stage in football and delivered a performance that no one thought was possible just 11 weeks earlier. And all it took was his head coach telling him, "Don't be afraid to make a mistake." Now, why were those words so powerful to Phil Simms? Well, because when you play the quarterback position, you're always existing on a fine line. You have to be aggressive and careful at the same time, and that's a tough thing to do, and that's why playing the position is so difficult. But you can't play that way if you don't have confidence. If you're thinking too much about what the consequences are of your throws, you're not going to be able to grip it and rip it and fit balls into tight windows. And in my opinion, it's one of the responsibilities of the head coach or offensive coordinator or quarterback's coach or whoever has that relationship with the quarterback to get them to a place where they're not afraid of making a mistake, to sense when they're playing tight, and to figure out what buttons to push to get them back on the right track. So why am I talking about something from nearly 40 years ago? Well, it's because the NFL is cyclical. And even though the game has changed, the things that were needed to be successful back then are largely the same now. What happened to Simms wasn't just unique to him. Every QB loses confidence at some point or another, with varying degrees of severity, obviously. And there are different ways of dealing with it. Which brings us to Bryce Young. Now, as I'm sure most of you remember, Young did not have a very good rookie season. In fact, it was somewhat of a disaster. His head coach got fired 11 games in. The Panthers had the worst record in the NFL. Young threw for less than 3,000 yards in 16 games, which would have been a concerning stat even during Phil Simms' era. And overall, he just didn't play like the quarterback we all saw at Alabama. Now, it wasn't all his fault. His offensive line was terrible. His receivers couldn't create any separation. But none of that mattered. Everyone was looking at the quarterback, and they were calling him a bust. And it certainly didn't help that the player selected one spot after Young, C.J. Stroud, went on to win Offensive Rookie of the Year, looked like a professional quarterback, helped turn the Texans from a 3-win team into a division winner, even won a playoff game, and that led to all these conversations around Young and the Panthers about how he was a mistake. The Panthers should have taken C.J. Stroud. Now imagine you're Young, you're entering year 2, and you've got to deal with all that. You've got to learn a new offense with a new head coach. You still have a talent deficiency around you because your receivers and offensive line, even though they're a little bit better, are still towards the bottom of the league. And you know that if you don't have a good year, the Panthers are probably looking in a different direction at quarterback the next year. And that could be the end of your career as a starter with the Panthers and possibly in the NFL. Who knows when you'll get another chance. Now, I can't get into Bryce Young's head, but I have to imagine that was weighing pretty heavily on him at the start of last season. Because it kind of showed in his first 2 games. He looked tight. He was playing fast, wasn't in sync with his receivers, wasn't recognizing the defense, picking up blitzes, was missing throws, was forcing throws. And not only did the Panthers get outscored 73-13 across those 2 games, but Young completed under 55% of his passes for less than 250 yards, no touchdowns, 3 interceptions, a very similar stat line to the 2 games that Simms played in '86 before everything came to a boiling point. There was one play in particular in his second game against the Chargers that was completely uncharacteristic of the way he played at Alabama, where he had an inbreaker coming from his left. There was a linebacker underneath that was in the way. Young just kind of stared him down, almost willing him to move, but the linebacker never moved. And Young threw it anyway, and the result was an interception. I don't want to speak for Dave Canales, but that was probably a play that he looked at and said, okay, something's not clicking here. I need to find the right button to push to get Young playing the way that we need him to play. Because Young isn't the type of quarterback that can go out there and not see the field clearly and get away with it. He has to play with anticipation. He has to play with timing. He has to be able to recognize the coverage and process quickly. Because he doesn't have the physical skills like a Josh Allen does to get away with making the wrong read or being late with a throw and still having the arm strength to wedge the ball into a tiny hole. Now, Canales could have taken the same approach that Parcells did and told Young, hey, just go out there and sling it. Don't be afraid of making a mistake. I'll back you no matter what. But I think he recognized that Young needed something different. He just needed a breather. He needed a mental break. He needed to have all the pressure around him released. And so Canales benched him. And you know what? I think it was the right move, because when Young came back 6 weeks later, he was a completely different quarterback. Now, this wasn't exactly the same situation as Simms and the Giants in '86. The Panthers didn't go on to win the Super Bowl. Instead, they went 5-12. But we're going to focus on Young here. In that first game back, even though the Panthers got blown out by the Broncos, he was facing a very good defense, and he was comfortable enough to manipulate defenders, work through his progressions, hang in the pocket, hit receivers late in his progressions. He was making better decisions. He was throwing with anticipation. He looked a lot like the quarterback that the Panthers thought they were getting when they drafted him number 1 overall. Most importantly, he looked like a confident quarterback. He had some big-time performances and some big-time throws against teams like the Chiefs and Eagles, who had some of the best defenses in the NFL, but also ended up playing in the Super Bowl, obviously. They lost that game against the Chiefs on a last-second field goal, but he was handling Steve Spagnuolo's blitzes. He was hanging in the pocket, taking shot after shot after shot, delivering the ball with anticipation, getting it out just in time before he was getting hit. The Panthers actually should have beaten the Eagles. They were going in for the game-winning score. Young threw a perfect post ball thrown with great anticipation. The defense didn't even know it hit them, and his receiver dropped the pass, so they ended up losing that game eventually. But the bottom line was that he performed like a quarterback who looks like he's going to be in the league for 10, 15 years if he keeps playing that way. Now, if you're looking for a good indicator of how comfortable Young was when he returned to the lineup, according to Pro Football Focus, He finished the season with the 9th highest frequency of throws traveling 20 yards or more from the line of scrimmage. So he was pushing the ball downfield. And PFF had him as the 5th highest rated passer on those throws. Now again, Young doesn't have a big arm, so this was all the result of his timing and ability to process and throw with anticipation. So I'm excited to see what Bryce Young will do this year. I don't know how good the Panthers will be, but I think we got to give Canales a lot of credit for getting Young back on track. And now the Panthers should be optimistic about the quarterback position both this year and in the long term. For those of you interested in a more in-depth analysis of Bryce Young's 2024 season, check out footballfilmroom.com. That's my website. Search for a post called Film Session, Bryce Young's 2024 season. There I break down about 40 plays from last year, show you the good, show you the bad, show you the ugly, show you the difference between how he was playing before he got benched versus after. And be sure to check out the rest of the website. Got a lot of different breakdowns on there. All right, let's talk about the Browns quarterback situation, which a lot of people seem to be talking about. First, Joe Flacco is the starter. No surprise there. They entered training camp that way. They're going to enter the regular season that way. It was going to take a lot to unseat him. And even though I think Dillon, Gabriel, and Shedeur Sanders did some good things during the preseason, neither did enough to change the Browns' plans at quarterback. So let's dive into each of these players and talk about how they performed during the preseason. We'll start with Shedeur Sanders. He played in 2 games. The first one went pretty well. There were some things to work on, but overall, it was a good performance. The second one, not so much. But we'll get to both of them. So in that first game against the Panthers, the thing that I liked most about Shedeur's performance was that there were multiple plays where he moved in the pocket, reset his feet, and found a receiver downfield. He had one throw from his own end zone where there was pressure coming from his left. He slid to his right subtly, still had to deal with the pressure, but just sliding to the right bought him a little bit of time. And then he delivered an accurate throw downfield on an in-breaker for the completion. Just a great play, a professional quarterback play. Sanders had another play like that, his second touchdown pass. Again, there was pressure coming from his left. This time it was on a blitz. Sanders' running back actually had to cross his face and come over to his left and pick up the blitz. Sanders moved to his right, regathered himself, reset his feet, found his receiver late in the play in the middle of the end zone, and hit him for a touchdown. There was another one, I believe on his final drive, where his receiver was wide open. I don't want to focus on that right now. But the pocket was kind of collapsing, or maybe not entirely collapsing, but it was condensing around him. And he was completely quiet in the pocket, stood tall, threw the ball over his line, over a defender, hit his receiver. Again, these are the types of plays that professional quarterbacks execute on a regular basis. So it was great to see him be able to do that. That means you know it's in there, and now it's just about doing it more consistently. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses for Shedeur in that first game. I know there were a lot of reports coming out of that game that the Browns should just scrap every single one of their quarterback plans they had going in. Shedeur Sanders had to be a starter. I didn't quite see it that way. There were a few things that he didn't do so well, and they were very similar to what he struggled with in college. So one of those was just the timing with which he played. Everything he does, he needs to do faster. I wrote about that heading into the draft, and it was still visible on his film against the Panthers in that first game. He had one play that probably should have been intercepted. The defensive back got his hands on it, couldn't reel it in, but it was another in-breaker, and Sanders was just too late to get rid of the ball, too late to throw it, threw it behind his receiver, took a couple extra beats at the top of his drop, and that's something that he does often. He has false steps at the top of his drop. He holds it a little too long. People talk about him patting the ball. It's a little bit of that, but it's just his motion's a little bit long. He takes a couple extra hitches or an extra hitch when he doesn't need to. Everything in the way he processes and plays just needs to be faster. And on this play, it almost led to an interception. There was another just sort of nondescript play that people probably don't remember. There was a hitch he was throwing to his left where, again, he took an extra hop, an extra step, and that allowed the defensive back to make a play on the ball, knock it down for an incompletion. There was another play from his own end zone where he actually had another in-breaker. There were a lot of in-breakers in this game. He had an in-breaker coming from his right, and there was no one in the way of the throw. This guy was wide open, but Sanders didn't throw it. So lost that phase of the play. He ended up scrambling, and then he had a wide-open receiver on the scramble, and he threw the ball at his feet. Now, the scrambling game is something I want to talk about with Shedeur because he had one play. He had one really good scramble in this game where he threw it downfield, and his receiver made a one-handed catch, but you got to give Shedeur credit. It was a good play. But he had two scrambles, including the one I just mentioned, where he missed the throw. And then he had another play where he spun out of a defender's grasp twice. It was a good play to evade pressure. And then he ran all the way across the field to his right. Not much happened on the play, but it showed some of his evasiveness. And I do think he's got evasiveness. He's got some athleticism. He did run for a first down on 3rd and 10. So he's an athletic guy. He's just not someone who's dynamic with his legs. He's not going to make a lot of plays with his legs. Unfortunately, he plays as if he has that ability at times, and that's where he got into trouble in college, and that's kind of where he got into trouble in this second game against the Rams. So first, let's preface his performance against the Rams with the fact that he wasn't playing with the number ones. Now, I'm not familiar enough with the Browns' depth chart to tell you if he was playing with a mix of 2s or 3s or anything beyond that. I don't know how many of the players that were blocking for him got cut the very next day. What I can tell you is that the Browns' performance, their offensive line, their protection, was not very good. He took 5 sacks. He was under relentless pressure, but he didn't help his cause at all. Of those 5 sacks, I had Sanders responsible for 3 of them. The first one was a 1st and 10 where he fled the pocket. He got to the perimeter, and instead of throwing it away, he ran out of bounds 2.5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. So that technically counted as a sack, and there was just no need for it. There's a difference between 2nd and 10 and 2nd and 12 or 13, believe it or not. But either way, there's no reason to take a loss of 2 yards. And your offensive line is not going to like taking a sack on a play where you're outside the pocket and you could have thrown it away. The very next play is one everyone's talking about where he lost 24 yards. This was an example where playmaker Shedeur kind of took over, where he evaded pressure at first, he spun out, and instead of, again, getting to the perimeter and giving himself an option where he could either run or throw the ball away if there was nothing there, he almost reversed field, or he sort of stayed in the middle of the field, but there was nowhere to go, and the end result was that he took a sack for a 24-yard loss, which you just can't do. And then the third sack he took, let me try to draw out what the play was as best as I can. The Browns went empty. They put a running back on the perimeter, and they ran Hoss Y juke. Now, Hoss Y juke, the play design here is that you have hitches on the outside, seams on the inside, and then there's a 5th receiver, a Y or a tight end, and he runs a juke route, which is basically he has a couple different options based on the way the defense is playing and based on the leverage of the defender who's covering him. Now, putting a running back on the outside, that was to get a coverage indicator. And the Rams matched up to him with a cornerback, which meant there was probably a 99% likelihood that this was zone coverage. Now, because the defense was wasting a cornerback on the outside on a running back and likely playing zone, that meant that there was probably a good matchup on the inside. And in this case, there was. The Y juke, you had a tight end aligned on a linebacker, and that's a route that you want to go after kind of any chance you can get. Now, I don't know exactly the matchup here where maybe it wasn't an athletic mismatch because, again, we're dealing with third-string players and whatnot, but that would have been the read. Now, the Rams did rotate to single high at the snap, so Shedeur could have looked at the seams first, and then if those weren't open or available, he should have been ready to come down to the wide juke by the time he hit his back foot, but he didn't. Instead, he looked out at the hitch, stayed on the route way too long, and that didn't really make sense from a decision-making standpoint because a running back versus a corner is not really a matchup that you want to target unless that corner is playing about 100 yards off. And that's because the running back generally doesn't run his routes with nuance. You don't know how consistent he's going to be at coming back to the ball. You don't know if he's going to do a good job of preventing that defender from undercutting him if he tries to jump the throw. And what's the best thing that could happen? You get a 5-yard gain? The juice is just not worth the squeeze in that situation.
The only reason you might look at the hitch is to get the defense flowing in that direction, and then you can hit a receiver elsewhere.
But Sanders didn't do that. He stayed on the route, and then he kind of didn't even really read it out. He never planted his back foot, which was an issue all day. He just was dropping back and drifting back, wasn't really ready to throw, wasn't ready to play with timing and get the ball out of his hands. Instead, he seemed to be watching the rush more than anything. And that got him into trouble because he wasn't ready to hit the wide juke, which was open at the top of his drop. Now, to be completely fair to Sanders, this was not a great situation. This was not a game where he was going to be able to do a lot. But you have to play the hand that you're dealt as a quarterback. And there are going to be times throughout your career, whether it's an entire game or a series or a quarter within a game, where you just need to be able to feel what the defense is doing, particularly when it comes to the pass rush. If your offensive line can't hold up, even though it's not your fault as the quarterback, at a certain point, you have to adjust the way you play. You have to speed up your internal clock. And if that means planting your back foot, getting rid of the ball to your first or second read until things kind of soften up inside, then that's what you have to do. If you have to be ready to throw the ball away, you got to be ready to throw the ball away. So if I was the Browns, I would have liked to have seen Shedeur respond to that game, not by going 5 for 5 for 75 yards and a touchdown, but by going 3 for 6 for 20 yards and only taking 1 or 2 sacks, throwing the ball away. And he didn't really do that. He didn't rise to the occasion, even though there wasn't much for him to do. Now that brings us to Dillon Gabriel, who I was really impressed with the way he played this preseason. He is a timing and rhythm passer. He was consistently getting the ball out within the natural timing of the play, within the natural timing of the offense. Did that in both games that he played. He was planting his back foot and throwing the ball with anticipation. He was very quick to process, and if he saw that his first 2 reads were taken away by the coverage, he would quickly move on to number 3. He completed passes out of muddied pockets. There were other plays where it didn't look like anyone was open, and he delivered the ball with great accuracy to the only place where the ball could be completed, and it was. He was doing the things that Shedeur Sanders needs to do. Dillon Gabriel plays the way that Shedeur Sanders needs to play. And maybe you could say that Shedeur is more physically gifted. I think he is, but I don't think it's by much, which means he has to play the way that Gabriel does. But Gabriel was very impressive, and I think he was the driving force behind the Browns trading away Kenny Pickett. Because I think they saw the way that he played, and they said if he has to come into a game because Joe Flacco gets hurt, he can at least run the offense. He can play with timing and rhythm. He can keep us on schedule. He's not going to make boneheaded mistakes. He's not going to take a lot of sacks. He's not going to lose a lot of yards. And so I thought coming out of his first performance that he had played better than Shedeur Sanders.
And then last week's game solidified for me that he should be the number 2. That's it for today's show. Our first podcast episode is in the books. I have to say I'm very excited to be doing this with you all. This podcast has been a long time coming. I don't know what exactly the posting schedule will be. I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants. I'd like to do this once a week, likely on Fridays, but I'll keep you posted on Substack. I'm also going to try to post some mini episodes, maybe some 5-minute episodes here and there to react to news or games or cool things I see on film. But again, I'll keep you posted on Substack. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.